Building the world of Bioshock Infinite didn't stop with the creation of Columbia. It was a task that required a cast of believable characters to bring the story to life. The game's protagonist, Booker DeWitt, presented a unique set of challenges. Unlike the original Bioshock's protagonist, Booker needs to exist in the world as much more than a cipher. He's his own character with his own goals and motivations, but he still needs to be relatable to a broad spectrum of players.
You have to establish very quickly at the beginning who he is, what he wants, most difficultly what he knows and what he doesn't know, because you can't have a real delta, a real distinction between what a character knows and what the player knows. So, like, for instance, if the player knows there's a bomb in the next room, but the character has to walk through the door and the character doesn't know, it's very frustrating, because you're like, don't go in that room, but there's a character going into that room. And vice versa, if you feel the character has all these secrets he's keeping from you, you start to get very frustrated because you're like, well, why don't I know this stuff? On the other hand, it's not like you want to start the game by having the character read his autobiography. So there's all that exposition and then all that balance, and that took a ton of back and forth and having people play the game and saying, oh, I don't trust him, or I don't like him, and then figuring out why they didn't trust him or why they didn't like him. So we spent a ton of time in that lighthouse and that rocket ship on the boat, figuring out what all those details are going to be.
To better understand Booker, you need to look at his reason for coming to Columbia, which is to say, his mission to retrieve Elizabeth. More than just an objective, Elizabeth becomes Booker's companion through the bulk of the game, as well as the emotional anchor of the story. Art director Sean Robinson knew that the design of the character had to be pitch perfect, or her entire presence would unravel.
Our first iteration of her, and I wouldn't even call her Elizabeth at the time, is more of a character that we built for tests, testing out facial animation, things like that. Looked a lot like a Gibson girl, and Gibson was an illustrator from the late 1800s. He did a really nice pen and ink line drawing. So we did we created a character. She had a huge bustle coming out her back, which is a nightmare to animate. The tight bun and fairly proportional, realistic features. And we did some tests with her, and out of those tests, we discovered a lot of things. One of the things was, we really wanted to hand animate all of her features. We didn't want to do facial capture. And the other aspect was, the proportions that you see on Liz now. Like we wanted her to have bigger eyes than normal to really express her emotion from a distance. And even in most video games, when you're up close to someone, because of the field of view of the camera, they still feel far away from you, and it's still sometimes hard to read expression on characters' faces. So, we went from this fairly realistic and dull Gibson girl in iterations through up until the Liz we have now.
As the guardian and protector of Elizabeth, Songbird strikes a unique emotional chord that hasn't been explored in video games. It presents familiar tones of the menacing bully, but also evokes feelings of desperation and jealousy. Songbird was written long before anyone knew what the character should look like, and no one would know until it took shape before the art team's very eyes.
Songbird was one of those characters where we had Rob Waters, our senior character artist, doing sketch after sketch after sketch, and it was one of those things, and you can't really put words to it. It's like the minute we saw the sketch, it was like, that's it. Everything before that, like, oh, this is a cool drawing, this is cool, I don't know what it is, it's cool. But the minute, he did this drawing of Elizabeth reaching up and touching Songbird on the head, I wish I could go into the voodoo that would explain that a little better. It was just one of those collective aha moments, like when the art team saw it and Ken saw it, there was no questions about iteration or go back to the drawing board. It's like all of a sudden everybody's just like, that's it. Let's go with that. That thing's awesome. That's like way better than anything else that's been on the drawing board. And there are plenty of really cool guys that you're like, oh, this could be cool. But when you look around the team and everybody at the same time has that, exact epiphany, it's like, we're not going to let this one go, right? That's it.
The city of Columbia rests on the shoulders of its enigmatic founder, Zachary Hale Comstock. As the leader of the founders, he created a city based on religious devotion and American exceptionalism. A character based on these ideals could easily be reduced to a collection of villainous tropes, and it proved a challenge to keep his motivations believable.
He was one of the toughest characters for me to write because I don't feel, I don't have a religious background. And let alone sort of, the darker side of his beliefs and the racist side of his beliefs. So I really had a lot of trouble writing him for a long time. And it occurred to me I had to figure out why do people follow him? That was the key to his characters. Why do people follow him? What does he provide to them? And I struggled with that for a long time because obviously, an ecstatic religious experience is something that a religious leader provides, but I don't have a connection to as a writer. And it's always hard when you try to write something that you have never felt, and that would feel dishonest to me. So I struggled, and actually I ended up having some conversations. There was a scene in the game at the end where there was a gentleman here, one of our artists, who got to a point in the game, played it, turned off his computer, turned off Bioshock, opened up his computer, opened Microsoft Word, and wrote a resignation letter. It had offended him so much. And I ended up having a conversation with him. My first impulse was, I don't want this guy to go, because he was a good guy and a talented guy. And we ended up actually having a long talk, and he was an extremely religious guy. And when we started talking, I realized that something I could connect to was the notion of forgiveness, and how powerful, what an important part that is of the New Testament, and why, Christ was such a revolutionary figure. And thinking about how I would incorporate that notion, the power of that notion, into Comstock, into sort of his world, was to me the key, because who hasn't done things that they don't want to be forgiven for?
Just because the city flies don't mean it ain't got its fair share of fools. All right, still got a girl to find.